Hi all. The final knockout stage of the British Championship was actually two rapid games, 30-minute I believe, between Adams and Short, and this was played early on Saturday, just after the prize giving, and I think it was a bit unfair on Nigel in particular, who did have a tough time the round before. And having to get up that early, I don't think he's that brilliant early in the morning. He sort of mentioned that anyway on his Facebook page, that he wasn't playing too well. He didn't feel he played too well. But the first game was a draw, so it was the second game. Adams was white, and I was watching it live. And yeah, I think it was an interesting game. So let's have a look at it. Adams kicked off with E4, and I think there's an instructive theme about you can have roads of attack to the opponent's king without cars, and it's funny because if you remember the Nigel Short Simmel where I lost to Nigel Short, I was trying for a G-file attack which never really got off the ground, especially because Nigel castled queenside, so the G-file didn't mean much. So that's like a road without a meaningful destination having the G-file, but here it was like roads without cars, and it was in fact Nigel Short with the G-file, but there were no cars on it to get to the opponent's king, and the king was actually on the king side, but what seemed to be holding Michael Adams' position together was this knight on the rim, a rule-breaking knight on the rim. So why was that so special? And because the black king was on the queen side, you know, that was a meaningful target for queenside operations. So how did this emerge? Caro-kann, solid enough to start off with, but instead of the classic, you know, solid variation with bishop f5 here, in fact knight f6, so creating potentially losing trump cards, I'd say, you know, offering the double pawns in exchange for dynamism. It was taken with the g pawn. It can be taken with the e pawn as well. So I think Bronstein was using both, Larsen and Bronstein. Maybe Larsen more with G takes rather than E takes. But in this game, G takes. So we've got this scene set here for a road, potentially against White's king, usually, you know, sitting on G1. So in my Simmel against Nigel, cheekily, of course, he castled on the queen side, and he, you know, later played G3, and it really meant nothing, the G file. So this structural damage had with it a downside in my Simmel game that I felt in that video, if you review that video, that structurally, against this structure, factor out the king safety aspects of the position, but White is often in a position, especially with E6, to carry out C4 and D5. Now if you look at the resulting potential fragmentation, if there's a pawn here and C takes, E takes, say these pawns get dissolved, okay, so all these pawns, imagine they get dissolved, these guys. You end up with a structure where White has two pawns here against Black's two pawns, and Black has really bad pawn structure on the king side. Isolated pawn here and isolated double pawns here. So this D5, that's why it's such a powerful thematic break. One could say it's like a sort of even worse than a minority attack, this C4 and D5. So what role would a knight on the rim have, which is coming up? I mean, I'll try and prepare you for this concept, but it's amazing to think if you have a knight on H4, it can go into F5 once this pawn moves away from E6. So just bear that in mind. Okay. So that's the thematic kind of break in theory. If you factor out king safety, White would want to play for D5 against this structure with pawns on C6 and E6. So let's get back into the game. Knight F3. And now an annoying, you know, Knight F3 looks to be inviting an annoying pin actually. Because some players might be tempted, you know, C3, Bishop D3 and Knight E2, you know, forget, so Bishop G4 there's F3, but it's walking straight into this annoying pin, this Knight F3. And apparently there's an interview on the Full English Breakfast by two very strong players, Lawrence Trent and another GM that held Nigel Short to a draw. Okay, but so in the interview, Adam said it was part of his preparation for another tournament, this whole system. So knight f3, many of you may be surprised by this knight f3, just walking into this pin and win. So bishop g4. But there's an amazing idea. It's just an amazing concept which I've alluded to already. Okay, so bishop e2. Nothing magical about bishop e2, unpinning. After e6. Now look, we've got the g-file road. What does white do? Castle straight into it. So, some of us as black might be licking our lips saying, oh, we're just going to castle queenside. Double rooks on the g-file. And that's the end of white's king here. Okay, you could think that, but look what happens now. Knight d7, and white, as though factoring out, the king safety aspects, just looking at the structure, this central kind of break, with d5 would be so damaging. So c4, not content with c3, queen c7, which is good for the queen, enables castling queenside, enables bishop d6. You've seen me play like this hundreds of times in the French defence burn variation, with often some interesting games and interesting attacks. But here is the crux move of the game. A rule breaking move. A knight on the rim is dim. So when do we break these general rules? It all depends on the position. And here there's a requirement in the position for king safety, extra king safety somehow, against this black dynamism on the g-file. So the knight on the rim being dim is justified here, it seems, by the evidence of this game. Knight h4, a stunner. Because not only is it to do with the king safety, it's to do with this thematic break. Because only d5 and ed, the knight will be ready to pounce. Okay, to f5, that could be a key square as well. From f5 in front of the double pawns, that's Nimzovic's favourite knight in front of double pawns. So what does black do here? He doesn't voluntarily want to just give up, the light square bishop and weaken his light squares. That would leave the queen on e2, which is quite a good square, and then he could connect rooks immediately with bishop e3 and just aim for d5. No, Nigel plays h5, and white doesn't really want to try and win a pawn here. It might be dangerous. So actually, he just encourages the bishop to be exchanged now. He leaves the pawn on h5 because that's, kind of defensive. It's shielding white's king on the king side. So h3. Okay, so exchange of bishops. And now black castles queenside. So we've got the road. Have we got the cars? Can we get the cars to the g-file? Can the g-file have doubled rooks anytime soon? Well, what about the thematic break in the centre? Very, very calmly, Adam simply plays rook d1. So this thematic break in the centre, which would leave terribly bad pawns in theory, would also potentially give a huge knight on f5, which is a light square where black hasn't even got a light square bishop anymore. So strategically, this is almost as good as a knight on d5, a knight on f5. And this d5 is almost as good as a minority attack in terms of fracturing pawns. So we've got two major strategic concepts being used against black in this game. The thematic pawn break in the centre and a huge, powerful knight on a colour of square where there's no, bishop to defend that colour complex. So that f5 is a vulnerable light square potentially. So bishop d6, and now we have the thematic, central break, d5. It just seems very, very simple play from white. Minimal pawn moves on the king side. g2 also being defended, even if black had loads of extra moves to double up rooks, it still wouldn't be a major threat because, g2's covered. But rook de8 was played here. So is white worried by e takes d5? No. Adam simply just connects his rooks calmly with this move. Okay, he's eyeing a7 potentially in some variations, but also c5 might be a threat, with maybe rook c1 to come up. So, in fact, a surprising move from black, sort of surprising, because maybe, as black, pardon me, as black I'd be tempted to play c5, but that might be a bit passive. You can imagine c5 and then e5 is just asking for knight f5, and then that bishop be a real target on d6. I'm not sure about this move though. What would the engine play here? Let's just see what a Houdini move would be here. Actually, it kind of likes bishop c5. It's giving c5 after. So c5 or bishop c5. Okay. Okay, it's changing its mind quite a bit. Rook d8 now. Alright, alright. So bishop c5 was played. And we have now the trade of dart square bishops. And white, you know, with d5 has weakened, as I've mentioned in many videos, these two dart squares. So, okay, white's playing potentially on the light squares as a result of this d5, and black potentially on the dark squares. But unfortunately, white's also going for black's king. Okay, which is a sitting target on the queen side. So b4, another forcing move, d takes. B takes looks quite ugly, leaving like isolated pawns. So queen takes. And now we see c5, and it looks as though this c pawn is spearheading an attack. 3-2 on the queen side anyway. But c5 is threatening in some lines, plays c6. So Nigel's attack hasn't started yet. The cars are still not on the motorway. They're not doubled up yet on the G file. He needs maybe to get more central control. Maybe this next move is about trying to get more central control, f5. Because you can imagine if this knight can reroute to e4, then that might be really dangerous. Okay, but the calm move rook d4 is played now. Not other tempting moves like b5, but just rook d4. Because rook d4 actually maintains the option of b5, but also the option of just doubling up rooks on d7. So after queen c7, but no, the rooks weren't doubled here. Instead, rook c1. So this rook being on d4 has some extra flexibility than being on d1. It can transfer over here, or if this pawn moves, maybe, you know, over here. So the option of rook c4 has been created by the move rook d4, as well as that option, if needed, of doubling rooks. But it wasn't seemingly the intention. It's just, you know, mainly, I think, this lateral movement is now afforded by the rook on d4. Okay, so king b8, and now the knight, which has done its duty of discouraging a g-file attack, comes to contest the central square, which has now been weakened by that f5, that e5 square. So knight f3, you know, maintaining control of the e5 central square. Now, after rook d8, we see another surprising tactical move, a temporary pawn sack at the right time here. c6. c6. Because if takes, and I'll check this before, then just rook dc4. And this pawn is very, very difficult to defend in that position. The knight cannot defend it very easily, and that would be giving white a big initiative. So Nigel, unfortunately, is faced with a very unpleasant pawn now, which he dare not take. He plays knight f6. And now we see b5 just simply reinforcing that pawn on c6. And the knight's also protecting the rook on d4, which doesn't need to move. But it's taken now. The knight takes. And now we see b6. The damage has been done on the queen side. This is like a goal-hanging pawn now, a goal hanger. This pawn on c6, where the goal is the king here. This open road, this motorway wasn't used. It was like no cars ever used the motorway to white's king. And now we've got a new avenue. With this f5, it wasn't just e5 that was weakened, it was f6 and g7 along this diagonal. And this is one move I'd actually correctly anticipated, believe it or not, queen b2 at the time of the game. Because it carries with it actually, you know, tactical threats, just you know, skewering on these guys to play either e6 or f5, winning material. So rook h6, awkwardly defending on that diagonal. Now the knight just comes back to f3, and now finally a rook is put on the motorway to white's king. But unfortunately, you know, so much damage being done, the queen cannot get on this diagonal to try and coordinate with the rook. But it has got f4. It has got f4. But this is extinguished now with knight e5. So rook g8, and now rook d1. So the queen's been kept out of f4, and the rook and knight cannot create an attack, it seems, in this position very easily. And also now there's a menacing threat of knight d7, with a rook coming to the 7th rank. You can imagine queen e5 being really dangerous. Here knight d5 was played. After check, the king moved to a8. And now a very, very interesting move, because the road that white needs to get to the black king is actually this road. And how does he do that? How does white do that? Get to that back row. He plays knight f6, just breaking down the barrier on the d file to gain access to d8 square. Temporarily, he's made a concession though, inviting the queen potentially to come to f4 at the end of this. So we saw knight takes, queen takes. But look, white is eyeing d8 now, with both queen and knight. a6 was played, and now the open invitation to come to f4, rook d7. And this is really a crushing blow, because if the queen goes back, then just queen takes f7, just crashing through on the 7th rank. After queen f4, nothing spectacular is needed, like rook a7 check, which I incorrectly mentioned. No, just a very simple move now. I hope you can spot it if I give you 10 seconds. Okay, because we've got a goal hanging pawn on c6. Does rook d8 check? The queen and pawn are enough for a mating net. Black resigned here. If you look at potential continuation, well, queen b8, there's c7, just winning totally with that passed pawn. And if king a7, then the goal hanging pawn is just mating the black king. So, I mean, what do we say in terms of dynamism? It seems that black's dynamism on the g file was totally suppressed by a very, very paradoxical looking knight on the rim move, knight h4. But functionally, the knight not only parrying g file pressure, but supporting the central thematic break of d5 to give it much more impact, not just structurally destroying black, but also this f5 square on a colour complex, which has been neglected now because the exchange of the light square bishops happening here. So we have here d5, the thematic break, and then basically it started to go really badly downhill on the queen side with this goal hanger created now. When white played c6, he's creating this goal hanging pawn, which all he needs is a further breakthrough. Even with a simplified simplification, it's enough, with very, very minimal material to get a very, very dangerous attack against the black king, because it's acting like an extra piece, this pawn. And check was the final, crushing move, which won Michael Adams the British Championship. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks so much.